Welcome to Spiritual Psi-Kology. My name's Renee McKenna, and I bring my 30-plus years as a recovering addict and ex-crazy person turned therapist and shamanic healer to bring you snackable teachings on spirituality, psychology, and all things personal growth. And today I want to talk about the Four Immeasurables. They're also known as the Four Limitless Qualities, the Brahma Vihara, or the Four Divine States of Dwelling. And Buddha emphasized cultivating or nourishing these states of mind in our life. And the four immeasurables are loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and joy. And I think the reason that they're called the limitless qualities or the immeasurables is that these attitudes or states of being offer the possibility of kind of infinite growth and potential. We never master joy. We don't reach a limit with our ability to express or feel compassion, to practice loving kindness, or to expand this really deep attitude of equanimity in our life. And equanimity was the one that I had never heard of before, of course, because it's the one I was least practiced at. And we live in a culture that kind of discourages equanimity. And equanimity is kind of rooted in the same word as equality. And it's an attitude of freedom from attachment and aversion. And our Western consumer culture, that's also kind of relationship addicted, is very into attachment and aversion, which is avoidance. And Buddhism is all about freedom from suffering. And Buddha teaches that suffering is rooted in attachment and avoidance. And so to practice equanimity is to have the desire for everyone, including ourselves, to be freed from the suffering of attachment and aversion, which is about deep acceptance and presence about what actually is right now, knowing that all things are impermanent, but also in an infinite state of recreation. The whole birth and death, gain and loss thing that really fucks us up as humans. I remember going to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts one evening, and there was the Asian art wing, and it was kind of near the medieval or Renaissance art wing, or at least we visited them both concurrently. And we went through all this religious art from medieval and Renaissance Christianity. Gorgeous art, but so violent. Jesus bleeding, being tortured on the cross, lots of saints being tormented. I mean, certainly some beautiful artwork, too, of the Madonna with baby Jesus, but it was so striking to go into the Asian wing and see all the incredibly peaceful, smiling Buddhas, the happy, naked, dancing gods and goddesses of Hinduism. It was like, whoa. Which path do you want to take? The path of suffering, strife, and torture, which leads to redemption? Or you want to sit fat and happy on a lotus, smiling with peaceful equanimity at the unfolding of the birth-death continuum. Yikes. It was like a commercial for the Zen Center, I'll tell you. Nothing against Christian iconography. I think one of the great teachings of the Jesus story is divine compassion for our human suffering. Although I think the pinnacle message is actually about rebirth and the death-rebirth process that isn't just about actually dying, the final death, but it's about personal growth and evolution, that old things must fall away so that new things can be created and arise. And that is how evolution happens. Emotionally, physically, relationally, spiritually. And Buddhism, from my perspective, is more about aligning ourselves or having peace with that process. And equanimity is one of the ways to do that. And where equanimity was really striking for me was in my attitude toward others and the suffering of other people. I'll talk about the difference between compassion and empathy in a minute, but because of my own suffering, I've always had a lot of compassion for the suffering of others. And equanimity is really about allowing people to have their own experience, and that includes their suffering. It's an incredibly mature perspective to hold suffering and joy with equal weight and to be non-attached. It actually brings tremendous freedom, the idea that everyone has their own karma, their own life path, and that my job is to have my own right attitude and perspective and to grow in the Four Immeasurables and to not spend time worrying about other people, trying to control them, manage them, help them, manipulate them. We can hope and pray and wish for the freedom from suffering of others. But if we're suffering over other people's suffering, then we need to find that freedom for ourselves. And can I be as unattached to my children, my lover, my ego, ideas about myself as I am with my clients or my students, my spiritual teachers or my long-term friends? So the virtue of compassion, different than empathy. Did an early podcast on the difference between empathy and compassion. Number 16, the problem with empathy. And the problem with empathy is that I am tying my own feelings up with my projected or perceived feelings of another. In empathy, I'm feeling for someone or with them, and that always includes my own projections. And often a good dose of my own unresolved emotional problems that I'm identifying with the other person's circumstance. This comes up a lot with death or other extreme difficulties, that people will approach others in the way that they would wish to be approached, assuming that the other person feels the way they would feel. I remember when my father died, and I didn't tell a lot of people because I knew what would happen, which is that most people said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. That must be terrible for you." And if they weren't close to me, I would just say, "Oh, thank you." And those that I had more of a relationship with, and it felt worth it to go into it, when they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," I could actually say, "Don't be." Because my relationship with my father had been one of continual suffering, particularly over the last 7 years of his life when he was completely absent, didn't come to my wedding, didn't acknowledge the birth of my children, my graduation from graduate school. I've done tremendous work on that relationship since he passed. There's still a few bags that need unpacking there, but his death felt like a resolution for me. It simplified things, ended the suffering. I didn't have to struggle with, am I going to send a Christmas card with pictures of the kids, knowing I won't get anything in return, and can I do that because it feels like the right thing to do on my end, and let go of any expectations and not feel hurt when I hear nothing back? That was a year-by-year question, and it went different ways, different years. And I didn't have to ask that question anymore. So people were offering me their empathy, but it was completely through their own filter. And we all do that. And it actually makes the other person feel unseen. It's a little self-centered, actually, although well-intentioned. And because I often have unusual emotional responses to things, when someone has a great difficulty in their life, I find it most helpful to ask, "How is that for you?" Or something more neutral like, "That sounds really intense." And compassion is more of an attitude than a feeling. It's like a state of being, a resonance. I had a teacher once who said, compassion is the safest place to sit in any circumstance in your life. Fear, anger, revulsion, excitement, desire, those all throw us a little bit off balance. And compassion makes room for all of it with open-heartedness, curiosity, and sympathy, acknowledging that we can never really know another person's experience, but we can be open to growing to understand them. And that openness to grow in understanding, intentionally putting my energy toward understanding, not just intellectually, but emotionally, energetically, spiritually, to really be present with and see an other clearly without putting our own feelings, judgments, perspectives in the way. It's very powerful. Buddhism doesn't talk about a god or a deity, but it talks about the energy of compassion. That is the transformative agent in much of Buddhist practice. And if we look deeply at Christianity, that is essential to the teachings of Jesus. Deep compassion as an agent for healing and transformation. We all have room to grow there. And loving kindness, which is the desire for all beings to be happy. An open-hearted, generous spirit. And if you look at most Buddhist imagery, whether it's Tara or Buddha or any of the bodhisattvas, they generally have an expression of loving kindness on their face. And looking at where we have received loving kindness in our life is an excellent place to consider how to cultivate that for others. I remember clearly my first experience as a young adult with loving kindness. I was early in recovery and very close to relapse. I think I was about 30 days sober, and they gave me a little chip that said 30 days on it. And I was so excited. I ran back to tell some of my old friends who I used to use drugs with. And I went to see my friend John, and I said, John, I'm 30 days clean. And he was like, really? I never noticed you had a problem. And he said, hey, you want to go take a ride? I got a little errand to do. And I always liked John, so I said, sure. So we get in the car. He says, here, put this in your bra. And he hands me an envelope with 9 grams of coke in it. And so I stuck it in my bra. And we drive over to make the delivery, just in case we got pulled over by the cops. And I gave him the envelope, and he took 6 of them out and gave me 3 back. And he said, put that back in your bra. And he made the deal. And he said, hey, I'm going to go get a motel and a case of beer. You want to come? And we can do this coke. And I was like, dude, I have a 30-day chip. And he just looked at me kind of all crazy. And I said, oh my God, you better bring me back to my car. And I gave him the envelope. But I really wanted to go to the hotel. I love snorting coke with a bunch of cold beer nearby. And I ran to this 12-step meeting. And I told them what happened. And it was a bunch of old white men at this colonial church in Hingham, Massachusetts. And at the end of the meeting, this man came up to me and he handed me a book. And he said, it was really great to have you here tonight. I hope you come back. And I was used to old men coming up to me, giving me stuff. And usually they wanted something in return. Sometimes they'd even get it. And I said, how much for the book? And he said, oh, it's free. It's our gift to you. And I was like, what? He said, no, please take it. We give things away here so we can keep them. And I got to tell you, it really screwed me up. Everything was an exchange in my life up to that point. Everything was a transaction. I was in my early 20s, but I was a bitter, hardened young woman. And this man was giving me something, and he didn't want anything in return but for me to be well. I felt like the Grinch at the end of The Grinch Who Stole Christmas when his heart grows. I was experiencing loving kindness, friendliness and generosity without attachment, truly wishing only for my highest good, with no motive for itself. That was not something I had cultivated in my life up to that point. And that was a very long time ago, and I'm sure that man has passed away, but his loving kindness changed my life that day. And I did not go back to the hotel with John. And so that brings us to joy as a source of power. And joy is different than happiness. Joy comes from within us. It arises from the practice of these other virtues. Happiness, from my experience, is kind of like the weather and often determined by external experiences or forces. Like the weather is determined by the air pressure and the temperature and the wind and the season. And joy is like the flow of life energy that comes from within us, that has peace, equanimity, compassion, and loving kindness for all of those seasons and weather patterns. And we can cultivate joy by doing things we like to do, by being creative, silly, laughter, fun, not taking ourselves so seriously. I'm going to cultivate some joy today. One of my favorite things to do in the whole world is to dress up. And I met a woman last week who likes to dress up too. And I put it out to some of my friends, and we are going to play dress up today and go down to an art festival in the Mission District of San Francisco. And I'm going to put on a little face glitter and make my hair all big and wear a funny hat and be my own artwork. Have some fun. Some people find joy in listening to music, being with animals, walking in nature, reading a great book, connecting with friends, playing with children, making art, dancing. And again, I see happiness as something that kind of comes into us, like it comes into our eyes or our throat or in the top of our head and kind of goes down and nourishes our body. Joy kind of arises up from within us. At least it does from me, and pours out of me into the world. And there's kind of a feedback loop with joy and happiness. They cultivate each other. And I feel like when I'm plugged in, joy can run through me like current through a lamp. And I'm unconcerned about what other people think or feel, that the joy that runs through me is a light for them. Whether they choose to step into it or not, I'll try to have equanimity around that. I think it's one of the things Jesus was talking about when he says, be as little children. And children often have the capacity to just plug into their own inner joy and be unconcerned about the perceptions and perspectives of others around them. Till we teach them to worry about what others think, and then they need to go to therapy. And that's why I'm here. So I wish for you to cultivate joy, equanimity, loving kindness, and compassion in your life, and to travel the infinite path of the Four Immeasurables. Thank you so much for listening. My first round of spiritual experience groups are going to start to wind up, and a new 6-week session is going to start in mid-April. Small groups of 4 to 6 like-minded seekers, really safe and supportive space to do your own deep inner practice in community with others under my spiritual direction. Because I want this work to be available to as many people as possible. I offer those on a suggested donation basis, and there's a range, and there are scholarships available. So if you think you're interested, shoot me an email, info@reneemckenna.com. You can find out dates and details on my website, and there's a link to that page in the show notes. I'm doing 2 or 3 deep teachings on Insight Timer every week. Those are free offerings, usually sessions about 45 minutes where I give a talk and then we actually do a practice ranging from inner child work, dissolving the inner critic, power retrieval and exchange. So be sure to check out my free offerings on Insight Timer. And if you'd like a free download of the first chapters of my book, there's a link in the show notes for that as well. Deep gratitude to my supporters on Patreon. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.